In September 1929, in America, the stock exchange crashed. It was the prelude to a decade of worldwide hardship and uncertainty. Banks and currencies collapsed, and world trade declined to a third of its level before 1914. In September 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard, which for centuries had fixed the value of its currency and underpinned its prosperity through trade. But in Britain and America, the miseries of the 30s were borne with resignation. The economic disasters did not lead to political transformation. The Anglo-Saxon democracies survived the 30s, whereas in Germany and Austria, the old autocracies, the anarchy and confusion of the early 20s were vastly stimulated by the economic turmoil that followed. Agitators flourished. Joseph Goebbels helped to build up the popular appeal to Germans of the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, and of the ideas and philosophy of a man who called himself Adolf Hitler. Hitler's personality and Hitler's ambition largely dominated the 30s and 40s in Europe. Hitler's Nazism was a flamboyant summation of the philosophy of European imperialism without the morality, the sense of responsibility, the integrity, and with the addition of anti-Semitism. But the stage management was brilliant, and in 1932 Hitler won 2 out of every 5 votes in the German elections. In January 1933, he became Chancellor. The burning of the Reichstag later that year helped to give the then President of Germany, Marshal Hindenburg, an excuse to grant Hitler absolute power. In his first speeches, Hitler promised to resurrect the powerful glories of Germany's past, and he rapidly replaced Germany's democratic institutions with the tyrannical militarism of the SS state. He was welcomed with open arms as the savior of Germany. The peace settlement at the end of the First World War failed in almost every respect. The victors were promised reparations which were almost impossible to collect. The vanquished were left in moral and political disarray. Some of the minor victors did not feel they'd received enough credit for what they'd done. Italy in particular was very dissatisfied by the Treaty of Versailles, and this was one of the grievances that provoked the Black Shirts, led by Benito Mussolini, to march on Rome in October 1922. Mussolini was one of Hitler's models. He became first the Prime Minister of Italy, and then the undisputed political and military leader of his country. Hitler had the same aspirations, and he used film for propaganda purposes to publicize his successes. In the first instance, he did succeed. He succeeded in rearming Germany in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. The unemployed were put to work. Then Hitler succeeded in stimulating national pride, which stimulated national aggression and led to the quest to recover the territories lost to Germany after the First World War. Italy, meanwhile, was almost in competition with Hitler's Germany to see who could make the most progress most quickly, by the most high-handed means. In 1935, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia, and with modern weapons which included gas, planes, and field guns, the Italians massacred the tribal warriors against whom they were pitted. Mussolini's attempt to create an Italian empire in Africa excited worldwide condemnation. Abyssinia appealed for help to the League of Nations, and warm promises of support were made by European nations such as Britain and France. But nothing was done, and in October 1935, the Emperor Haile Selassie was forced to flee his country. The The League's failure to help Abyssinia was Hitler's precedent when he ordered his troops to march into the Rhineland in 1936, in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. It was the first of many occasions when the German army bullied its way through international law. No war, never again, pleaded the German artist John Hartfeldt with this cartoon of a dove spitted on a bayonet. But Hartfeldt, like many other Jews, had to flee Germany to escape Hitler. These Jewish refugees, like the scientist Albert Einstein, were the fortunate ones. In Germany, the aggression and violence of the Nazis led to book burning and racial persecution. The immense energy of the Nazi Party and its militias was devoted to terrorizing the Jews and other minorities and to the suppression of resistance within the German population. Loyal Germans were warned not to shop at Jewish shops or deal with Jewish traders. Most of the synagogues were burned. By 1938, Hitler had taken control not only of the Rhineland, but of the Sudeten area of Czechoslovakia and of the whole of Austria. Germany was the dominant power on mainland Europe, and in Spain, during the Spanish Civil War, the Germans and Italians developed new armaments and military strategies. Dive bombing and high-altitude bombing of civilians were introduced during the Spanish Civil War. Between 1936 and 1939, using German planes and weapons, General Franco and the Spanish nationalists took over Spain and Spanish North Africa from an elected Republican government. The fascists had triumphed again. At the Munich conference in September 1938, Britain and France tamely accepted Hitler's conquest of part of Czechoslovakia. They were given what they believed was a binding promise not to invade the rest. Neville Chamberlain came back to England to assure the British public of Mr. Hitler's honourable intentions. But peace in our time was not precisely what Hitler and his staff had in mind. Hitler took over the whole of Czechoslovakia and invaded Poland in September 1939. The Russians seized the opportunity to move west. Poland's small army was unable to resist the blitzkrieg attack. German and Russian troops dismembered the country which had been recreated by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Poland's nationality was snuffed out so easily because of Hitler's unlikely alliance with Russia, the Nazi-Soviet pact. Russia, led by Joseph Stalin, was afraid of confronting Germany. Stalin's attempts to modernize Russian farms and Russian industry during the 1930s had caused such widespread confusion that Russia was incapable of fighting a successful modern war. Britain and France declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939 because Hitler had attacked Poland. In Britain, aliens were interned, amongst them the many German Jews who had fled from Hitler. The railings in the parks were removed and used for the war effort. The munitions factories went on overtime. The whole civilian population, even children and babes in prams, were required to carry and practice wearing gas masks. A small British expeditionary force set off for France, but there was no fighting yet. This was the phony war. Superficial optimism mingled with grim determination. In April 1940, with Central Europe under Axis control, the Germans unexpectedly overran both Denmark and Norway. Immediately afterwards, they also conquered Belgium, Holland, and eventually the whole of France. The British Expeditionary Force was hurriedly withdrawn to avoid being overwhelmed. At Dunkirk on the 3rd of June 1940, the British lost touch with Europe, which Hitler now dominated completely. Italy chose this moment to join the war on Germany's side. On the 22nd of June 1940, in the railway carriage at Compiègne, where the Germans had surrendered to the French in 1918, Hitler, surrounded by his commanders, prepared to receive the surrender of the French. The French representatives were led by Marshal Weygand. It was an ironic occasion. Hitler, a former corporal in the German army, had led his country to a lightning victory over the old enemy, France. When Hitler returned to Berlin in July 1940, he was greeted with hysterical enthusiasm. It seemed that all the risks involved in retaking the Rhineland, in the invasions of Czechoslovakia and Austria, in invading Poland and conquering France, regardless of the opposition of the British, had paid off handsomely. To many Germans, he became a demigod. Only Britain opposed him, and neither Britain's planes nor Britain's soldiers could strike at Hitler's heartland. However, neither could Hitler subdue Britain. Air attacks were not enough. Hitler needed air supremacy. During the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain produced a new war legend. As Churchill said, never was so much owed by so many to so few. The daytime attacks were defeated, but in revenge, the Luftwaffe began to concentrate on nighttime attacks. London and many other cities were laid waste. Paradoxically, the Blitz strengthened the British will to win, just when Britain was completely isolated, with America still very reluctant to be dragged into a war against Hitler. At the end of 1940, all the cards appeared to be in Hitler's hand. Japan would soon become an ally. Russia had signed a non-aggression pact. America remained neutral. Hitler dominated the strategic discussions which then took place, but he made mistakes. Success had gone to his head. He frittered away troops and time in North Africa to help the Italians, and in the Balkans. In June 1941, expecting an easy victory, he turned against Russia. This was to prove his great mistake. As with Napoleon, the immense scale of his conquests was bound eventually to overstretch his resources. When Hitler attacked Russia, all the traditional techniques of the Blitzkrieg, well honed over the previous 5 years, were put to work. Film cameras accompanied the first wave of attacks, for propaganda was an important element of Hitler's war. The dive bombers caught Russian aircraft on the ground. Many aircraft and many tanks were left burning in the first days of the offensive. The Red Army commanders were no match for the Germans, and millions of Russians were captured or killed immediately. It seemed that nothing could stop Hitler's armies. The war against Russia was like a crusade to the Germans. Priests blessed the troops before battle, and a new invention, color film, was used to photograph the enslavement of the Russian population. But as the winter of 1941 came on, exceptionally cold, minus 42 degrees, the Germans, who depended very much on pack animals and simple transport as well as on tanks, began to have difficulty. Everything around them had been burned, either by their own efforts or by the efforts of the partisans and the retreating Russian armies. In the east, the Japanese were also a threat to the Russians. Japan had conquered large areas of China during the 1930s. It was Russia's near neighbor, and Japan had convincingly defeated Russia in the War of 1904. The invasion of China in the 30s was Japan's bid for empire. The Japanese felt that they deserved more than they'd got in the First World War. The militarization of Japan went ahead in the 1920s. In 1926, the new emperor, Hirohito, reviewed the Japanese Navy after his coronation. Japan's invasion of China provoked the famous communist retreat into the interior, the Long March. Japan turned to the south, away from Russia. The invasion of China brought Japan into competition with America. American interests in the east were directly threatened by Japan's activities even before World War II. In December 1941, the Japanese decision to launch a surprise attack on America was a turning point of the Second World War. America was catapulted out of isolationism by Japan's preemptive strike on the main US base at Pearl Harbor and Hitler's simultaneous declaration of war. The Japanese attack virtually destroyed the American Pacific Fleet in just one day. But strategically, it was a blunder. America, Russia, and Britain were forced to become allies. In the east, the Japanese launched a fierce onslaught on the British in Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and other British territories. Their fighting skills and skills of endurance had been vastly underestimated both by the British and the Americans. British forces were badly led and badly prepared. They surrendered in their thousands. Even before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had conquered Korea, China, and most of Indochina. By 1942, they had conquered or controlled the Western Pacific and stood at the gates of India. Japanese warriors and the Japanese state exerted relentless authority throughout the East. Even before 1941, President Roosevelt lent active American assistance to Britain. At the Newfoundland meeting in August 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed on strategy. Germany would be conquered first, Japan afterwards. Germany was regarded as by far the greater threat. The German Empire was at its most powerful by November 1942. German power extended from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara, and from the Atlantic Ocean almost to the Caspian Sea. Britain had been reduced to using strategic bombing as its only war weapon against Germany. Now America set itself to mass-produce bombers. And the caption for this poster, "Pour it on," summarizes the approach. "We have just begun to fight," claimed this recruiting poster in 1942. America's main initial contribution was to supply Britain across the Atlantic. The Atlantic War cost many lives and ships, and recruiting for it was one of Britain's main priorities between 1941 and 1943. Britain had been on the defensive since 1940, in spite of Churchill's flamboyant defiance during the Blitz. Now Anglo-American cooperation made possible both the eventual assault on Hitler's fortress Europe and the development of the atomic bomb. World War II was a war of new weapons. Hitler's included the V-1 flying bombs and the V-2 rockets late in the war. Britain developed radar. As early as 1939, large aerials had been erected on the south coast of England, and these transmitted radio waves which bounced an echo from an approaching aeroplane. At the receiving station, blips on the screen of an oscilloscope represented the distance that the echo had traveled. If two or more stations could fix on a plane, it was possible to be sure of its position, heading, and speed. By the middle of the war, the chain of radar stations on the south coast made it impossible for any hostile aeroplane to approach Britain without detection, but purely defensive measures would not be enough to defeat Hitler. Victories at Stalingrad and Kursk began the Russian breakthrough. The Allies invaded North Africa. The campaigns in North Africa were, in a sense, a substitute for a direct assault on Europe, a second front. With the experiences of the Great War still fresh in the memory of British commanders, Britain was reluctant to launch a direct assault on France. But Montgomery in Africa could operate with a relatively free hand, and won great victories at Alamein and Tunis. It was the beginning of the end for the Nazis. The invasion of Sicily was launched in July 1943. the Russians pushed the Germans back on many fronts. In the summer of 1944, on the south coast of Britain, the greatest combined operation of all time began to take shape. The invasion fleet mustered in mid-channel and then hit France. D-Day, on 6th of June in 1944, was a triumph for the American and British forces and for the planners behind them. Most of the Allied troops got ashore in very good order. Although casualties during the invasion totaled 100,000, it was a remarkably successful operation. The breakout from the beachheads was also much easier than might have been expected. The German counter-offensive in the Ardennes was defeated, and Allied forces went forward towards the German border. The processes of liberation began with cheers and deep emotion as collaborators and German officials were taken into custody. The liberation of the concentration camps revealed the scale of the systematic brutality which had been involved. The horrors of Belsen, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz brought tears to the eyes of the soldiers and survivors. Germany was in ruins. Refugees crammed the roads. Berlin had been laid waste by the Allied bombing raids and Russian guns. Russian and American forces met on a predetermined line, and that line now divides West and East Germany. Other German territories further east were returned to Poland. At the Yalta Conference, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill bartered territories and peoples throughout Europe. But the Pacific War still had to be fought to a conclusion. Tenaciously and bloodily, the Americans battled from island to island towards Japan. Their Japanese prisoners were in good condition and in good heart. They were not short of arms and equipment. They seemed determined to fight on. The Americans, meanwhile, were very vulnerable from the air. It took many months of hard fighting in the East Indies, the Philippines, and on the mainland to bring the Allies within bombing range of Japan. The Allies then took the decision to use the first atomic bombs to extinguish Japanese resistance completely. A new age had begun.